the wind moves differently across the Crow Reservation in late August, carrying with it the dry scent of cut hay and the last heat of a Montana summer that refuses to let go easily. Hardin sits at the edge of that world, a small town of a few thousand people pressed against the Bighorn River, where the boundaries between the reservation and the county blur into something that looks, on a map, like a single community, but which functions in practice as two systems of law running side by side, each with its own jurisdiction, its own priorities, and its own blind spots. It is into this landscape that we return again and again to understand what happened to an 18-year-old woman named Kaysera Stops Pretty Places in the final days of August 2019, and why, more than 5 years later, her family is still waiting for the answers that most families in America would expect to receive within weeks. Kaysera had grown up on the reservation, a member of the Crow Nation, and by all accounts, she was the kind of young woman whose presence altered a room the moment she entered it. Those who knew her described someone athletic, quick-witted, and instinctively protective of the vulnerable, a teenager who had a habit of bringing home stray animals she found wandering near her family's property. Unable to simply walk past a creature in need, she was entering her senior year of high school that fall, a milestone that should have anchored the following months in ordinary teenage rhythms: homecoming, college applications, the small rituals of a life still being built. Instead, the last weekend of August became the point around which her entire story would collapse inward. A set of hours so ordinary in their beginning and so devastating in their end that even now, investigators, journalists, and her own family struggle to reconstruct exactly what took place. On Saturday, August 24th, 2019, Kaysera was staying, as she often did, with relatives in Hardin, a town she moved through easily, comfortable in its streets in the way that only someone who has spent a lifetime there can be. She spent that evening with a small group that included a young woman named Isabella Villegas, Isabella's boyfriend, and another teenage girl. What should have been an unremarkable night among friends took a turn when a conflict erupted between Isabella and her boyfriend, a dispute serious enough that, according to accounts later gathered by journalists and advocates, he physically restrained her when she attempted to leave. The other girls present tried to intervene, to help Isabella get away from the escalating situation, and at some point that evening, a police vehicle appeared on the scene, drawn by the disturbance. What role, if any, this altercation played in what happened next to Kaysera remains one of the central unresolved threads of the case, a loose end that her family has pulled on for years without ever fully unraveling it. What is certain, because it is the fact around which everything else orbits, is that after that Saturday night, Kaysera Stops Pretty Places was never seen alive again by anyone willing or able to come forward. No one reported her missing. No alert went out across the county or the reservation. In a case involving a native teenager in a border town straddling tribal and county jurisdiction, the machinery that exists to search for missing persons simply did not activate, and for 5 days, while her family in a nearby community assumed she was still with friends or relatives, as young people her age often were, during those final unstructured weeks of summer, Kaysera's body lay in a residential yard in Hardin, face down, partially concealed behind a pile of tree trimmings in a neighborhood where people walked their dogs and children played within a short distance of where she remained undiscovered. This detail, more than almost any other in the case, has become the fulcrum on which the family's grief and suspicion turn. Hardin is not a wilderness. It is not an isolated stretch of prairie where a body might reasonably go unnoticed for the better part of a week. It is a small town, densely enough populated that residents know their neighbors, where a pile of yard debris in a backyard is the kind of thing someone eventually walks past, mows around, or simply notices has changed. The idea that Kaysera's body remained undetected for 5 full days in that setting is one of the details that her aunt, Dr. Grace Bulltail, has repeatedly described as deeply troubling, raising the question of whether the location and timing of the discovery point to something more deliberate than coincidence, or whether it is simply a grim illustration of how easily a young Indigenous woman can become invisible, even in a town small enough that everyone, in theory, should have noticed her absence. When her body was finally found, the response from local authorities did not resolve the growing unease among her family. It deepened it. There was no missing persons report on file to connect to the discovery. It would take approximately 2 additional weeks, according to accounts from relatives, before Kaysera's family was formally notified that she had died, an agonizing gap during which her grandmother, Yolanda Fraser, has described a state of suspended disbelief, the sense of losing something without yet being permitted to grieve it, because grief requires certainty. And certainty was precisely what the system failed to provide. The autopsy, when it came, offered little in the way of clarity. Conducted at the end of August 2019, the post-mortem examination found no evidence of physical injury and no evidence of underlying disease. This absence of visible trauma might, in another context, suggest a natural or accidental death. And yet, the medical examiner's office was careful not to rule out one particularly significant possibility: asphyxiation, a cause of death that by its nature can leave minimal or no external physical markers, especially on a body that has already begun to decompose in the August heat over the course of several days before discovery. Ultimately, the Montana Medical Examiner's Office classified both the cause and the manner of Kaysera's death as undetermined, a bureaucratic phrase that, for her family, functioned less as a scientific conclusion and more as an open wound, a verdict that closed no doors and answered no questions, leaving them suspended between the possibility of accident and the far darker possibility of homicide, with no official finding to guide them toward either. It is worth pausing here to consider what undetermined actually means within a forensic and legal system, because the term carries enormous weight in how a case proceeds or fails to proceed. An undetermined manner of death does not mean investigators found nothing suspicious, nor does it mean they found conclusive evidence of an accident. It means the physical evidence available was insufficient to establish, beyond the standards required, precisely what occurred. In cases where a body has undergone significant decomposition before recovery, this ambiguity becomes almost structurally inevitable, and it creates a particular kind of injustice for families, because the absence of a definitive homicide ruling can become, whether by design or by consequence, a justification for law enforcement agencies to deprioritize a case, even when the surrounding circumstances, the lack of a missing persons report, the delay in notification, the location of the body would seem to demand rigorous scrutiny rather than administrative closure. For Kaysera's family, this is precisely what appeared to happen. In the years immediately following her death, they have described repeated frustration with the Bighorn County Sheriff's Office, with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which holds jurisdiction over certain major crimes occurring on or near tribal land under long-standing federal law, and with the Montana Department of Justice. According to statements made by the family's attorney, Mary Catherine Nagel, the lack of movement in Kaysera's case was not attributable to an absence of leads or evidence, but rather reflected a systemic unwillingness or inability to pursue the investigation with the urgency the circumstances warranted. The family has said they provided law enforcement with tips and information they believed could aid the case, only to watch months and then years pass with no visible action, no arrests, no charges, and, for a long stretch, no real communication about what, if anything, was being actively pursued behind the scenes. To understand why this happened, or at least why it was allowed to happen, requires understanding the peculiar and often devastating jurisdictional architecture that governs criminal investigations on and around tribal lands in the United States. The Crow Reservation, like many tribal nations, exists within a patchwork of overlapping authority. Tribal police, county sheriffs, state investigators, and the FBI each hold jurisdiction depending on factors including the nature of the crime, the identity of the victim and the suspect, and the precise location where an incident occurred. A death that takes place a few hundred yards inside reservation boundaries may fall under an entirely different set of investigative obligations than one that occurs just outside them, in the county proper, even though, to anyone standing at that boundary, the land looks identical, and the community, its families, and its histories are inseparably intertwined. This fractured system has long been cited by tribal advocates, legal scholars, and federal reviews as a central driver of the crisis known as Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Relatives, or MMIWR, a term that describes not a single event, but a sustained pattern, decades in the making, in which Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people disappear, or are killed at rates dramatically disproportionate to their share of the population, while the resulting investigations move, when they move at all, with a sluggishness rarely seen in cases involving non-native victims in similar communities. The numbers surrounding this crisis in Montana are not abstract. Native Americans make up a small percentage of the state's overall population. Yet, at various points during the years following Kaysera's death, they have accounted for roughly a quarter of the state's active missing persons cases, a statistical disparity so stark that it has been cited repeatedly by journalists, legislators, and advocacy organizations attempting to explain why cases like hers so often stall. It was against this backdrop that Kaysera's death and the public outcry it generated within her community became a catalyst for concrete institutional change. In the months following her death, alongside continued advocacy from families across the state, Bighorn County moved to establish a task force specifically dedicated to investigating missing and murdered Indigenous persons cases. An acknowledgement, however belated, that the existing systems had failed, and failed repeatedly, to protect and serve the community from which Kaysera came. Around the same period, state legislation known as Hannah's Act was signed into law, creating new protocols intended to improve coordination between tribal, state, and federal agencies when a Native person goes missing, named for another young Indigenous woman whose disappearance had similarly exposed the gaps in Montana's response system. None of these reforms, however welcome, altered the fundamental trajectory of Kaysera's own case for years. Her family did not wait passively for institutions to act. They organized. They held vigils and rallies in Hardin, returning to the same streets where Kaysera had spent her final known hours, carrying signs, saying her name aloud in public spaces as a form of both mourning and protest. They spoke on panels addressing the broader MMIWR crisis, using Kaysera's story to illustrate a pattern that extended far beyond any single town or county. They petitioned elected officials at the state and federal level, insisting that the absence of an active homicide investigation was not evidence of an accidental or natural death, but evidence of a system that had, in their view, decided early on that Kaysera's case was not worth the resources a more visible victim might have commanded. Each August, as the anniversary of her disappearance approached, the family renewed their calls to action, a grim annual ritual of advocacy born from necessity rather than choice. Because, as Dr. Bultail has said in various public statements over the years, no family should be forced to serve as the primary engine driving forward the investigation into their own child's death.